Let's get started. Story number 1.
The snowstorm hit on January 12th, the worst one in decades, according to the news. I hadn't planned on being at the old family cabin that week, but life has a funny way of forcing you into uncomfortable situations. My father had passed away 3 months earlier, and it was up to me to clear out his belongings from the cabin before we sold it. I delayed the trip for weeks, but now it couldn't wait any longer. The cabin sat on the edge of a frozen lake, deep in the woods of northern Vermont. It had been in our family for generations, though we rarely visited anymore. My father, however, had always loved it and spent his final years there, alone. The place carried an air of melancholy now, a shadow of the warmth I remembered as a kid. I arrived just as the snow started falling, fat flakes swirling in the wind. The driveway was already buried by the time I reached the cabin, and I had to park my truck halfway down the road. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the scent of cedar and something faintly metallic. The silence was heavy, as if the house had been holding its breath since my father's passing. By the time night fell, the storm had become a full-blown blizzard. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and piling snow against the walls. I lit a fire in the hearth and set up camp in the living room, trying to make the space feel less cold and foreign. As the hours passed, I found myself flipping through my father's old notebooks full of sketches and ramblings. He'd always been a private man, but his writings hinted at an increasing paranoia in his later years. By midnight, the power went out. I wasn't surprised. The cabin was old and the storm was fierce. I lit a few candles and sat by the fire, the flickering light casting shadows on the walls. It wasn't long before I heard the first knock. It was faint at first, just 3 soft taps on the front door. I froze, the notebook slipping from my hands. Who would be out here in this storm? The nearest neighbor was miles away and the road was impassable. I grabbed a flashlight and approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I opened the door a crack, the icy wind biting at my face. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. I shone the flashlight into the night, but the beam was swallowed by the swirling snow. There was nothing there. I shut the door quickly, bolting it behind me. My heart was racing, but I told myself it had to be the wind. Maybe a tree branch had hit the door, or the wood had settled in the cold. I returned to the fire, trying to shake off the unease. An hour later, it happened again. This time, the knock came from the back door. It was louder now, more insistent. 3 deliberate raps, each one echoing through the cabin. My stomach twisted as I grabbed the flashlight again. The back door led out to the woods, where the snow was even deeper. I hesitated, then opened the door. The scene was the same. No footprints, no sign of anyone, just the storm, howling and endless. I slammed the door shut, locking it tight. My hands were shaking as I backed away, the flashlight beam trembling with me. That was when I noticed the footprints. They weren't outside, they were inside. A single set of wet footprints trailed across the wooden floor, leading from the back door toward the staircase. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at them. They were large, barefoot, and impossibly clear. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Whoever, or whatever, had knocked on the door had already been inside. I turned slowly, the flashlight beam sweeping the room. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows. The air felt heavier now, colder, as if the warmth of the room was being siphoned away. I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "Is someone there?" The only response was the wind. I followed the footprints to the base of the staircase. They disappeared halfway up, as if the intruder had simply vanished. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It wasn't possible. None of this was possible. And then I heard it. A low creak from the loft above me. I froze, every muscle in my body locking in place. The loft had been my father's bedroom. I hadn't gone up there yet, too unsettled by the thought of sifting through his personal belongings. Now I wished I'd never come to the cabin at all. The creaking continued, slow and deliberate, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my knuckles white. I didn't want to go up there, but I couldn't stay where I was. Whatever was in the loft was waiting. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step feeling like a lifetime. The air grew colder with every step until my breath fogged in the beam of the flashlight. When I reached the top, the door to the loft was ajar, swinging gently in the draft. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was empty, just as I'd left it. The bed was neatly made, the dresser untouched. But the air felt wrong, heavy and oppressive, like the walls were closing in. Then I saw the mirror. It was an old, full-length mirror that had always been in the loft, its frame intricately carved with floral patterns. I remembered it from my childhood, a relic from a time long past. But now, as I stood in the doorway, I realized the mirror wasn't reflecting the room as it should. Instead, it showed something else entirely. The reflection was of the same room, but darker, colder. The bed was unmade, the blankets tangled and stained, the walls were cracked, the wood rotting. And standing in the center of the room was a figure. It was tall and thin, its body shrouded in shadows. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing and unrelenting. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. When I looked again, the mirror was normal. The room was as it should be. But I couldn't shake the image from my mind. I fled the loft, slamming the door behind me and racing down the stairs. I spent the rest of the night by the fire, too afraid to sleep. The footsteps didn't return, but the sense of being watched never left. When morning finally came, the storm had eased, and the world outside was blanketed in pristine snow. I packed my things and left without looking back. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the cabin disappearing into the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the window, watching me leave. But when I blinked, it was gone. I haven't been back to the cabin since. We sold it later that year, and I've tried to put the experience behind me. But every January, when the snow begins to fall, I find myself thinking about that night, about the knocking, the footprints, and the figure in the mirror. I don't know what I encountered during the snowstorm of January. I don't know if it was a ghost, a spirit, or something worse. But I do know one thing. Whatever it wasn't human. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snowstorm of January 2015 was one of the worst in Minnesota's history, burying the state in drifts so high they swallowed entire cars. I hadn't planned on being caught in it, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. My friend Adam had been begging me for weeks to help him renovate an old cabin he'd bought deep in the Northwoods. I had put it off for as long as possible, but guilt eventually got the better of me. The drive up was uneventful at first, but by the time I reached the cabin, the storm was in full swing. Fat flakes of snow fell in waves, and the wind whipped through the trees, rattling the skeletons of the pines. Adam's beat-up truck was parked outside, nearly hidden under a blanket of snow. I pulled up beside it, grabbed my overnight bag, and made a mad dash for the front door. Inside, the cabin was warm, but eerily quiet. Adam was supposed to be there waiting for me, but the living room was empty, the fireplace cold. A pair of muddy boots sat near the door, and an open bag of tools lay on the table. "Adam?" I called, my voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. There was no answer. I walked through the cabin, checking the kitchen and the single bedroom, but he wasn't anywhere. The bathroom door was ajar, revealing nothing but a dusty clawfoot tub. The only sign of life was a thermos of coffee sitting on the counter, still faintly warm to the touch. I assumed he must have gone outside for firewood or to check on something. The storm was howling now, the wind slamming against the windows with enough force to make the glass shudder. I decided to wait, lighting a fire in the hearth and settling into the creaky old couch. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The storm grew worse, the sound of the wind like a chorus of wailing voices. I began to feel uneasy. Where could Adam have gone in this weather? I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising, given how remote the cabin was. Finally, I decided to brave the storm and look for him. I bundled up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped out into the freezing night. The snow was already knee-deep, and visibility was almost non-existent. I called his name, but my voice was swallowed by the wind. I circled the cabin, shining the flashlight into the surrounding woods. The beam of light reflected off the snow, creating a surreal, otherworldly glow. I saw no sign of Adam. No footprints, no movement, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. When I returned to the cabin, I was shivering and frustrated. I slammed the door shut behind me and peeled off my snow-soaked coat. That's when I noticed something strange. There were footprints leading from the back door to the living room. Large, wet footprints that hadn't been there before. My stomach dropped. I hadn't left through the back door, and the prints were far too big to be mine. I followed them cautiously, the flashlight in my hand now feeling woefully inadequate as a weapon. The prints led to the fireplace, where they abruptly stopped. There was no one there. The room was empty, just as I had left it. But the unease in my chest grew heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, then settled back on the couch, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the footprints. Maybe the snow from my boots had melted in an odd pattern. Maybe Adam had come back while I was outside and left again. I repeated these lies to myself until exhaustion finally overtook me, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. I woke to the sound of knocking. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and more insistent. 3 deliberate knocks, followed by silence, then 3 more. I sat up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight. The knocking was coming from the front door. "Adam?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic. I hesitated, then slowly unlocked the door and opened it a crack. No one was there. The snow on the porch was untouched, pristine. The wind howled around me, and I quickly shut the door, bolting it again. My hands were shaking as I stepped back, the flashlight trembling in my grip. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were coming from above me, slow, deliberate creaks on the ceiling, as if someone were walking in the attic. My blood ran cold. The cabin didn't have an attic. I stood frozen, listening as the footsteps moved from one end of the ceiling to the other. They stopped directly above me, and the air grew impossibly still. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and then a whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there. A single word repeated over and over, growing louder with each iteration. "Leave, leave, leave." I bolted for the door, grabbing my coat and boots without a second thought. I didn't care about the storm or the freezing cold. I had to get out of that cabin. As I opened the door, I glanced back one last time. The fireplace had gone out, and in the flickering shadows, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the darkness. It didn't move, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unrelenting. I ran to my truck, the snow nearly up to my waist. By some miracle, the engine started, and I tore out of there, plowing through the drifts with reckless abandon. The storm made it nearly impossible to see, but I didn't care. I just kept driving, the cabin disappearing into the blizzard behind me. I never found out what happened to Adam. The authorities searched the area once the storm cleared, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no personal items, nothing. It was as if he'd never existed. I sold the cabin as soon as I could, refusing to set foot there again. To this day, I don't know what I experienced that night. Was it a ghost? A spirit? Something worse? All I know is that the snowstorm of January 2015 changed me forever. Some things are better left alone, buried in the past like the cabin itself. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The snowstorm of January 1998 was a monster. They'd called it the storm of the century, a relentless blizzard that buried everything in its path under a suffocating layer of snow. It was the kind of weather that shut down entire towns, left people stranded, and created the perfect backdrop for old ghost stories. Only this time, the ghost story wasn't just a tale to scare children. It was real. And I was in the middle of it. I had been on my way to visit my aunt and uncle who lived in an isolated farmhouse about 20 miles outside of Duluth, Minnesota. My parents had begged me not to go. "Stay put, Lily," my mom had said over the phone. "The storm's going to be worse than anything you've seen." But I was stubborn. My aunt and uncle weren't in the best health, and they'd said they needed help with the animals before the storm hit. So against my better judgment, I loaded up my little Subaru and headed out. The snow started falling faster than expected. By the time I reached the old highway that led to their place, visibility was nearly zero. The world outside my windshield was nothing but swirling white. I couldn't even see the road anymore, but I knew I was close, maybe a mile or two away. I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached, silently praying I wouldn't slide into a ditch. And then my car stalled. I cursed turning the key in the ignition over and over, but the engine refused to catch. The cold was already seeping in, and panic crept up my spine as I realized I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with no cell service and no way to call for help. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening to the wind scream outside, until I finally decided I couldn't just sit there and freeze to death. I bundled up as best I could, grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment, and stepped out into the storm. I had no choice but to walk. The farmhouse couldn't be far, and I figured I'd follow the road until I found it. The snow was knee-deep, and the wind cut through my coat like a knife. Every step was a battle, my legs burning as I trudged forward, the flashlight beam barely piercing the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Relief flooded me as I realized it had to be the farmhouse. I pushed forward with renewed energy, stumbling through the snow until the outline of a building emerged from the storm. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. The building wasn't my aunt and uncle's farmhouse. It was smaller, older, and looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The windows were dark, and the porch sagged under the weight of the snow. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn around, but the storm was too strong. I needed shelter, and this was my only option. The door was unlocked, creaking loudly as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was frigid, but at least it was dry. The room I stepped into was sparse, with an old wood stove in the corner and a few pieces of rickety furniture scattered about. It smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic like rust. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer. The house was silent, the kind of silence that feels alive, pressing in on you from all sides. I shut the door behind me and shivered, brushing snow from my coat. My flashlight cast long, flickering shadows on the walls as I looked around. There were no signs of anyone living there, no food, no personal belongings, nothing. Just dust and decay. I found a pile of wood near the stove and managed to get a small fire going. The warmth was a welcome relief, but it did little to calm my nerves. Something about the house felt wrong, like I wasn't supposed to be there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I sat by the stove, I heard it, a faint knock. It was so soft I thought I'd imagined it at first, but then it came again. 3 deliberate knocks coming from the front door. My heart stopped. Who could possibly be out there in this storm? I grabbed the flashlight and crept to the door, my breath fogging in the freezing air. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I opened the door a crack, shining the flashlight into the swirling snow. There was no one there. The porch was empty, the snow untouched. I shut the door quickly, bolting it this time, and backed away, my pulse racing. The knocking came again, louder now. It wasn't from the front door this time. It was coming from inside the house. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The sound was coming from upstairs. 3 knocks in quick succession, followed by silence. My chest tightened as I stared at the staircase, the darkness at the top feeling like a living thing. I didn't want to go up there, but I couldn't just ignore it. Swallowing my fear, I forced myself to climb the creaking stairs. At the top was a hallway with 3 doors, all closed. The air was even colder up there, my breath visible in the beam of the flashlight. I moved to the first door, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. When I opened it, the room was empty. A small bedroom with a broken chair and a rotting mattress. Nothing else. The second door led to a bathroom, just as empty and decrepit as the bedroom. That left the third door at the end of the hall. The knocking started again, coming from behind it. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I stepped closer, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and run, but something compelled me to keep going. I opened the door. The room was empty, but the air was different, thick, suffocating, and freezing cold. The flashlight flickered again, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure in the corner. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by shadow. I blinked, and it was gone. The door slammed shut behind me. I screamed, twisting the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, closing in around me. And then I heard it, a voice, low and guttural, whispering in my ear. "Get out." The door flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. I didn't stop to think. I ran down the stairs, out the front door, and into the storm. I didn't care about the cold or the snow. I just needed to get away from that house. I don't remember how I made it to my aunt and uncle's farmhouse. When I finally arrived, frostbitten and shaking, they were horrified. They said they'd been waiting for me, worried sick when I hadn't shown up. When I told them about the house, their faces went pale. "There's no house out there," my uncle said. "Not anymore. It burned down 20 years ago during another January storm. The family inside, they didn't make it." I didn't sleep that night, or for many nights after. I never found out what I encountered in that house, or if it had even really been there. All I know is that I'll never forget the snowstorm of January and the shadow that still haunts my dreams. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm came suddenly in January, catching everyone off guard. Forecasts had called for light snow, but by mid-afternoon the sky turned an ominous gray and the snow began falling in thick, relentless sheets. The temperature plummeted, the wind howled like a living thing, and soon the town was buried under a thick blanket of white. I was visiting my uncle's old cabin on the outskirts of town, nestled deep in the woods. He had passed away the previous spring, leaving the place to my father, who had no interest in the property. The cabin was rustic and isolated, a relic of another era, but I liked its charm. I had decided to spend the weekend there to clear my mind, unaware that the snowstorm would trap me in a nightmare I'd never forget. By the time the storm reached its peak, the cabin's windows were crusted with frost, and snow piled high against the door. The power flickered, then went out entirely, leaving me with only the crackling fireplace and a battery-powered lantern for light. The silence outside was eerie. No birds, no animals, just the relentless wind whipping through the trees. I tried to settle in for the night, wrapping myself in a blanket on the couch, but unease prickled at the back of my neck. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint knocking at the door. It was slow and deliberate, like someone tapping with the back of their knuckles. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. Who could be out there in this storm? The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, and the road leading in was likely impassable. The knocking came again, louder this time. I grabbed the lantern and cautiously approached the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer, just the sound of the wind and the faint creak of trees shifting under the weight of snow. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door and cracked it open. The cold hit me like a slap, and the wind threatened to tear the door from my grip. I scanned the porch and the area beyond, but there was no one there. Just snowdrifts and the skeletal outline of trees bending in the wind. Shivering, I shut the door and bolted it tightly, telling myself it was nothing, maybe a branch blown against the wood. But the knocking returned, more insistent this time. It moved, not just at the door, but along the windows, as if someone or something was circling the cabin. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood in the center of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The sound stopped abruptly, plunging the cabin into an oppressive silence. I didn't sleep that night. The storm raged outside, and every creak of the old cabin set my nerves on edge. By morning, the snow had buried the porch completely, and the windows were nearly blocked. I considered trying to dig my way out, but realized it was futile. The storm wasn't letting up, and the road would be unrecognizable. As the day dragged on, I explored the cabin, trying to distract myself. My uncle had been a private man, and much of his life remained a mystery to me. In a small, dusty storage room, I found a box filled with old photographs and letters. Most were ordinary, family gatherings, fishing trips, but one photo caught my eye. It was of the cabin, taken in the 1950s. A group of people stood on the porch, smiling for the camera, but in the background, partially obscured by a tree, was a shadowy figure. It was tall and indistinct, but its presence felt deliberate, as though it had been watching. A sense of dread settled over me, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the photo. I flipped it over and saw a date written in faded ink. January 1952. Beneath the date were the words, "The storm that took them." My pulse quickened as I rifled through the rest of the box, finding an old newspaper clipping that confirmed my worst fears. The article described a deadly snowstorm that had struck the area in January 1952. A group of 6 people, stranded in a cabin in the woods, had vanished without a trace. The search party found the cabin empty, the door wide open and no sign of the occupants. The only clue was a set of strange tracks in the snow leading from the cabin into the woods and disappearing without explanation. That night, as darkness fell, the knocking returned. It was louder now, more aggressive. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once: windows, walls, the roof. I stayed huddled by the fire, gripping the poker like a lifeline. Then, as suddenly as it started, the knocking stopped. The silence was worse. It pressed in on me, thick and suffocating. And then I heard the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and unmistakable, coming from the upstairs loft. I stared at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my ears. The cabin was small. I knew there was no one else inside. But the footsteps continued, crossing the loft and pausing directly above me. Maxing every ounce of courage, I climbed the stairs, the lantern casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time I reached the loft, my breath was visible in the dim light. The room was empty, but the atmosphere was oppressive, as if something unseen was watching me. My uncle's old rocking chair sat in the corner, creaking softly as if moved by an invisible hand. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me with a force that shook the walls. Panic surged through me as I struggled to open it, the knob icy under my hand. When I finally burst out of the loft and stumbled back down the stairs, the fire in the hearth had gone out, leaving the cabin shrouded in darkness. The whispers began soon after. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the voices grew clearer, overlapping and urgent. They spoke in a language I didn't recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, warning. I covered my ears, but the voices grew louder, filling the room, filling my head. I couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing my coat and boots, I braved the storm, desperate to escape. The snow was knee-deep, the wind biting and relentless. But I didn't care. I stumbled through the drifts, my lantern barely cutting through the darkness. The forest felt alive, the trees looming like sentinels. I could feel something following me, its presence heavy and cold. When I finally reached the road, I looked back. Through the swirling snow, I saw figures standing at the edge of the woods, tall, shadowy silhouettes that didn't move, didn't speak. They just watched. My legs gave out, and I collapsed in the snow, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I woke up in a hospital bed, rescued by a snowplow driver who had spotted me near the main road. When I tried to explain what had happened, they chalked it up to hypothermia and exhaustion. I didn't argue. There was no way to explain what I had seen, what I had felt. The cabin was never the same. My father sold it that spring, and the new owners lasted less than a year before leaving without explanation. Locals say the cabin is cursed, that the spirits of the vanished still linger, trapped by the storm that claimed them. I don't know what I believe, but I've never gone back. Even now, when the wind howls in winter, I hear the faint echoes of those knocks, those whispers, and I know I'll never forget the snowstorm of January. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm hit on January 15th. The meteorologists had called it a once-in-a-decade blizzard, but even their dire predictions hadn't prepared us for the reality. I had been staying at my late grandfather's cabin in northern Michigan, trying to sort through his belongings after his recent passing. It was supposed to be a quiet week away from the city, but by the time the snow began to fall, I realized I'd made a mistake coming alone. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, a good 10 miles from the nearest neighbor. It was small but sturdy, built by my grandfather's hands when he was a young man. It had always felt safe, cozy even, when I visited as a child. But that night, as the storm howled through the trees and the snow piled against the windows, it felt anything but. By early evening, the power went out. I wasn't surprised. Storms like this always knock the lines down. I lit a few oil lamps and started a fire in the stone hearth, trying to push back the growing darkness. Outside, the wind screamed, shaking the walls and making the windows rattle in their frames. It was the kind of storm that felt alive, like it had a will of its own. I sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket and trying to read one of the old books I'd found on my grandfather's shelf. But I couldn't focus. The storm was too loud, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't just the isolation or the weather. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. Then, just past midnight, I heard it, a knock at the front door. It was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. 3 deliberate knocks, spaced evenly apart. I froze. Who could possibly be out here in a storm like this? No one knew I was here except my parents, and they were hundreds of miles away. My heart raced as I got up and grabbed the flashlight from the mantel. The beam shook as I made my way to the door. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Who's there?" "Just the wind." I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. The icy wind rushed in, biting at my face and sending snow swirling across the wooden floor. I shone the flashlight onto the porch, but it was empty. The snow was pristine, untouched, no footprints. Shivering, I shut the door and bolted it. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it had to be the storm. Maybe a tree branch had hit the door or the wind had rattled it just right. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I returned to the fire, but I couldn't relax. The storm seemed louder now, the wind wailing like a chorus of voices. I sat there, staring into the flames, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. But then I heard it again. This time, the knock came from the back door. It was the same. 3 deliberate knocks, each one echoing through the cabin. My chest tightened as I stood and made my way to the kitchen. The back door was smaller, leading out to the woodshed and the dense forest beyond. The window beside it was frosted over, but I thought I saw movement, a shadow passing by in the storm. I didn't open the door. Instead, I backed away, my pulse pounding in my ears. The knocking stopped, but the sense of unease only grew. It felt like the cabin was alive, like the walls were breathing with me. I returned to the living room, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The fire had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I sat down, my back to the wall, and tried to calm myself. But just as I was beginning to think the worst was over, I heard it. Footsteps on the roof. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. They started at one end of the cabin and moved to the other, then back again. My heart felt like it might burst out of my chest as I stared at the ceiling, the sound reverberating through the wooden beams. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind. Then, suddenly, the oil lamp beside me flickered and went out. The fire dimmed, plunging the room into near darkness. I scrambled to relight the lamp, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the match. When the light returned, I saw it. In the corner of the room, just outside the firelight, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its body cloaked in shadow. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I felt them boring into me. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The figure didn't make a sound, didn't move closer. It just stood there, watching me. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The shadows in the corner seemed to swallow it whole. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my back pressed against the wall, the poker clutched tightly in my hands. The storm raged on, but the knocking didn't return. Neither did the footsteps or the figure. Still, I felt watched, as if something unseen was waiting just beyond the circle of light. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. The world outside was eerily quiet, the snow glistening in the pale morning sun. I packed my things in a frenzy, determined to leave as quickly as possible. But as I stepped outside, I froze. The snow around the cabin was covered in footprints, large, bare footprints that circled the building over and over. They led to the front door, the back door, the windows, and even up onto the roof. My stomach churned as I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they simply stopped. There were no tracks leading away. It was as if whoever or whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. I drove back to the city that morning, leaving the cabin and everything inside it behind. I never went back. I sold the property a few months later, unwilling to set foot there again. To this day, I don't know what I encountered during the snowstorm of January. I've told myself it was just my imagination, that the storm and isolation had played tricks on my mind. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there that night, and it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. Story, the end.
Story number 6.
The snowstorm of January 1994 is a memory that still grips me, even after all these years. It was the worst storm in decades, a relentless blizzard that paralyzed our small town in upstate New York. Roads were impassable, power lines snapped under the weight of ice, and the howling wind seemed to carry a voice of its own. For days, the town was cut off from the outside world, and I, like everyone else, was stuck indoors. At the time, I was renting an old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. The house had stood for over a century, and it showed creaky floorboards, drafty windows, and a cellar that smelled perpetually of damp earth. It wasn't exactly cozy, but it was cheap, and I'd been living there for about 6 months. The storm began on a Friday. By Saturday evening, the power had gone out, leaving me with only the wood stove and a few candles to keep the darkness at bay. I remember sitting in the living room, bundled in blankets, reading a battered copy of Dracula by candlelight. The wind outside was ferocious, rattling the windows and whistling through the cracks in the old wooden walls. I'd always loved a good storm, but this one felt different, angrier, almost alive. Around 9 p.m., I heard the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow outside. I froze, the book slipping from my hands. Who would be out in this weather? I lived on a dead-end road, and my nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I stood up, my heart pounding, and moved toward the window. Peeking through the frost-covered glass, I saw nothing but swirling snow and the faint outline of the barn in the distance. I told myself it must have been the wind or an animal, but deep down, I wasn't convinced. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but it was there. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the front door. I stared at the door, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Whoever was out there would surely move on when they realized the storm had made travel impossible. But the knocking came again, louder this time. I grabbed the flashlight from the coffee table and crept toward the door. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaky. No response. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay away. But curiosity, or maybe a misplaced sense of duty, pushed me to unlock the door and crack it open. The cold hit me like a slap, and for a moment all I could see was a wall of white. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. A man, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes covered in frost. He looked as though he'd been walking through the storm for hours. "Please," he said, his voice hoarse. "I need help." I quickly stepped aside, letting him into the house. He stumbled over the threshold, collapsing onto the floor near the wood stove. Up close, I could see how bad he looked. His lips were blue, and his hands were trembling violently. I helped him out of his coat and boots, which were soaked through, and wrapped him in one of my blankets. "Thank you," he whispered, his eyes darting around the room as if he were afraid of something. I didn't think I'd make it." "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "Why were you out in this storm?" He took a shuddering breath, his gaze fixed on the flames in the wood stove. "My car, it skidded off the road about a mile from here. I tried to call for help, but my phone died. I started walking, hoping to find shelter." "You're lucky you found this place," I said. "You could have frozen out there." He didn't respond, just stared into the fire, his expression unreadable. I got up to make him some tea, leaving him to warm himself by the stove. When I returned with a steaming mug, he was gone. At first, I thought he might have gone to the bathroom or wandered into another room, but the house was small, and a quick search revealed that he wasn't anywhere inside. His coat and boots were gone too, but there were no wet footprints leading to the door, no sign that he'd ever been there at all. I stood in the living room, clutching the mug of tea, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The blanket I'd wrapped around him was still on the floor by the stove, but it was dry as if it hadn't been used. The rest of the night passed in a haze of unease. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When the storm finally began to subside the next morning, I ventured outside to see if I could find any trace of the man. The snow was deep, but I managed to make my way down the road toward the spot he described. About half a mile from the house, I found it. A car, half buried in a snowdrift, its front end wrapped around a tree. The driver's side door was open, and the interior was coated in a thin layer of frost. My stomach turned as I approached, my breath visible in the frigid air. Inside the car was the man. He was slumped over the steering wheel, his body frozen stiff, his face the same pale, gaunt visage I'd seen in my living room. But it wasn't possible. I'd let him into my house. I'd spoken to him, given him a blanket. How could he be here, dead, as if he'd never left the car? I stumbled back, my mind reeling. It didn't make sense. None of it did. I hurried back to the farmhouse and called the police. When they arrived, I told them everything, though I left out the part about the man appearing at my door. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. The officers confirmed that the man had likely died hours before I found him. They speculated that he'd tried to walk for help but succumbed to the cold before making it far. I didn't argue, but I knew what I'd seen. He had made it to my house. He'd knocked on my door. He'd spoken to me. That farmhouse was the last place I ever lived in that town. I moved out a few months later, unable to shake the feeling that the storm had brought more than just snow and ice to my doorstep. Even now, every time I hear the wind howl during a winter storm, I think of him, his hollow eyes, his whispered plea for help, and I wonder if he ever truly found peace. Story the end.
Story number 7.
It was January 2003 when the snowstorm hit. The weather reports had warned about a few inches of snow and some light flurries, nothing major. But as the night wore on, it turned into something much more dangerous. An unexpected blizzard with winds howling through the trees and snow piling up faster than anyone had anticipated. I had just moved into an old house on the outskirts of a small town in New Hampshire. It was a place I had found at a great price, and the owner was eager to get rid of it. The house was a 2-story Victorian built in the 1800s with tall windows and creaky floors. The moment I walked inside, there was something off about it. Not the kind of thing you can point to, but the feeling lingered. The air felt heavier somehow, and there were cold drafts despite the heat being turned on. Still, I was young, independent, and thought I could handle it. I had spent the day settling in, unpacking boxes, and getting used to the quiet. The snowstorm picked up just as the sun went down, and by the time night arrived, it was clear we were in for something much worse than expected. The wind rattled the old windows, and I curled up in the living room with a blanket and a book, hoping the storm would pass quickly. Around 10 p.m., just as I was about to turn in for the night, I heard a soft knock at the door. My heart skipped a beat. Who would be out there in the middle of a blizzard? I hesitated before walking to the door. I was still adjusting to the isolation of the house, and even though I had lived in remote places before, something about this house made me uneasy. I opened the door cautiously, peeking out into the swirling white chaos. There was no one there. I stood for a moment, confused, before closing the door, thinking maybe I had imagined it. But as I turned around, I heard another knock. It was louder this time. My skin tingled, and my instincts told me to stay away from the door. But curiosity got the better of me. I cracked the door open again, this time looking more closely into the snowstorm. To my shock, a man stood there, hunched against the cold, his clothes soaked through with snow. His eyes were wide, panicked, and his breath came in sharp gasps. He looked as though he had been out in the storm for hours. "Please, help me," he said, his voice shaking. "I've been stuck out there. My car, it's off the road, and I couldn't get back." I felt a sudden rush of sympathy. "Of course, come in," I said, stepping aside. He stumbled into the warmth of the house, shaking uncontrollably. I quickly wrapped him in a blanket, led him to the living room, and offered him a hot drink. "Thank you," he muttered, his eyes darting around the room nervously. "I didn't know where to go." I nodded, trying to reassure him. "You're safe here. The storm is really bad outside." He didn't seem to hear me. His eyes kept shifting to the windows as if he were listening for something. After a few minutes, he spoke again, this time his voice even shakier than before. "There's something out there. Something in the woods." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I was driving, and I saw something in the trees. Something that shouldn't be there. It followed me." I chuckled nervously, thinking that maybe the stress of the storm had gotten to him. "You've probably just been out in the cold too long. It's easy to imagine things when you're freezing." His gaze turned sharp, and he looked at me like I was missing something obvious. "You don't understand," he said. "I've been here before." I was taken aback by his words. "What?" "Here, in this house. I've been here," he said, his voice tinged with something I couldn't place. "Fear, maybe?" His hands trembled as he clutched the blanket tighter around himself. I stood frozen, my mind racing. He was acting as though he had been in this house before. But that didn't make any sense. I had just moved in, and I was certain no one had ever been here recently. No one had come to check on the place, and I had been alone up until that point. I was about to ask him what he meant when the power flickered. The house went dark, save for the dim light of the fireplace. "Stay here," I said quickly, heading to the kitchen to find candles. As I walked through the dark hallway, I felt an odd pressure in the air, like I was being watched. When I returned, I found the man standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the wall. The candles flickered as if disturbed by an unseen force, casting strange shadows across the room. "Are you okay?" I asked, concern rising in my chest. He didn't answer at first, his eyes focused on the wall with an intensity I hadn't seen before. Then, in a barely audible voice, he whispered, "I've been here. This house. It's the same, just like before." I felt a chill run down my spine. My heart pounded in my chest as the weight of his words sank in. What was he talking about? "Who are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What do you mean you've been here?" The man finally turned toward me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. I'm not supposed to be here," he whispered. "I died here, in this house." I couldn't speak for a moment. I felt the air grow colder despite the fireplace. Then I heard a sound, a tapping at the window. It was faint, but unmistakable. It was as if something or someone was tapping its fingers against the glass. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The window was covered in snow, but the tapping continued, growing louder. I backed away from the man toward the window. He was standing still now, staring at the wall again. "They're here," he whispered. "They know." I looked outside, my heart hammering in my chest. The snowstorm raged on, the wind howling in the night. But through the glass I saw it. Shapes moving in the trees just beyond the edge of the yard. Shadows. Figures too dark to make out, too unnatural. Suddenly the man cried out, stumbling backward. "No! They're coming!" I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. The storm had cut us off from the outside world. As I turned to the man, ready to try and comfort him, he was gone. Just like that. Vanished into thin air. The tapping stopped. The room was completely silent. I searched the house, every room, every corner, but there was no sign of him. No sign that anyone had ever been there at all. I looked outside again. The figures in the trees were gone. The snowstorm still raged, but the strange, eerie feeling had dissipated. The next morning, I called the local authorities. They sent someone to check the area around the house, but they found nothing. No footprints, no car, nothing to indicate anyone had been near the house at all. It's been years since that night, but every winter, when the snow begins to fall heavily and the wind picks up, I remember. I remember the man's frantic words, the tapping at the window, and the shapes in the trees. I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, the unmistakable sense that someone was trying to get in. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I swear I hear a faint knocking. 3 soft taps. Tap, tap, tap. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The snowstorm of January 2002 was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Growing up in upstate New York, I was no stranger to heavy snow, but this storm was something else. It rolled in fast, an unstoppable wall of white that erased everything in its path. Schools closed, highways were shut down, and people hunkered inside, praying their power wouldn't go out. I was one of them, alone in my tiny rental cabin on the edge of the Adirondacks. The cabin was a temporary escape. I had just gone through a messy divorce and needed a place to think, to breathe. My closest neighbor was a mile away, and the woods surrounding the property were thick and foreboding, but I liked the isolation. Or so I thought. That January evening, the storm was at its peak. Wind battered the cabin, howling like a living thing, and snow piled against the windows, blotting out the world. I had a fire going in the old wood stove and a mug of tea in my hands, trying to distract myself with a paperback novel, but the constant groan of the wind made it hard to focus. It was around 8 p.m. when I heard the knocking. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the shutters, but the sound was too deliberate. 3 sharp knocks, then a pause, then 3 more. I froze, my heart pounding. Who would be out in this storm? I stood and walked to the door, peering out through the frosted glass pane. The porch light barely cut through the snow, but I saw no one. I waited, half expecting another knock, but the only sound was the relentless wind. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a branch blown against the cabin, and went back to my chair. But the unease lingered, settling in my chest like a weight. Half an hour later, the knocking came again. This time it was louder, more urgent. I jumped to my feet, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. No answer. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and cautiously opened the door. The porch was empty. Snow swirled in the beam of my flashlight, and the wind stung my face. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. The snow on the porch was pristine, undisturbed. I shut the door quickly, bolting it this time, and leaned against it, trying to steady my breathing. That's when I noticed the smell, a faint, acrid scent like burning hair. It seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, filling the cabin. I wrinkled my nose, scanning the room for the source, but the fire in the wood stove was burning clean. The smell grew stronger, and I felt a sudden, inexplicable chill. Then the lights flickered. I froze, staring at the overhead bulb as it dimmed, surged, and went out. The fire in the wood stove was now my only source of light, casting flickering shadows on the walls. I grabbed a few more logs and fed the flames, my hands trembling. That's when I heard the footsteps. They were faint at first, barely audible over the wind, but they were there. Slow, deliberate, coming from above me. The cabin didn't have a second floor, just a small attic accessible by a pull-down ladder in the hallway. My stomach dropped. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace and crept into the hallway, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps continued, moving back and forth above me. I stared at the attic hatch, the smell of burning hair stronger now, making my eyes water. The footsteps stopped, and then the hatch creaked open. I screamed, stumbling back as the wooden ladder unfolded, its rungs hitting the floor with a dull thud. The darkness of the attic yawned above me, an inky blackness that seemed to pulse and breathe. I shone my flashlight upward, the beam trembling as it climbed the ladder. The attic was empty, or at least it appeared to be. The beam of light caught only dusty beams and cobwebs, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, like something unseen was pressing down on me. My skin crawled, and I felt an overwhelming urge to run, to leave the cabin and never come back. But the storm outside was a death sentence. I was trapped. The ladder suddenly slammed shut, the noise reverberating through the cabin. I screamed again, dropping the flashlight as I stumbled back. The fire in the wood stove flickered violently, casting wild, dancing shadows on the walls. And then I saw it. In the corner of the living room, just beyond the firelight, stood a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its face pale and featureless. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. The smell of burning hair was overwhelming now, making me gag. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It raised one hand, long and skeletal, and pointed toward the door. "Leave," it rasped, the voice hollow and inhuman. I bolted. I didn't think, didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat and boots, throwing them on as I ran out into the storm. The cold hit me like a wall, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The snow was blinding, and I stumbled through the drifts, the wind tearing at my clothes. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't stop. I could still smell the acrid stench, could still feel the thing's gaze on me. Somehow, I made it to the road. I collapsed onto the frozen pavement, gasping for air, and that's where a snowplow driver found me hours later. I was half frozen, barely conscious, and mumbling about a shadow in the cabin. When I told the police what had happened, they looked at me like I was crazy. They investigated the cabin but found no signs of forced entry, no footprints, nothing out of place. The only thing they noticed was a faint smell of burning hair that no one could explain. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't even bother collecting my things. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night. Was it a ghost? A hallucination brought on by stress and isolation? Or was it something darker, something ancient that lived in the woods, waiting for storms to draw people like me to its lair? I still have nightmares about the snowstorm of January 2002, about the figure in the corner, about its voice. And every winter, when the wind howls and the snow piles high, I wonder if it's out there, waiting for someone else to stumble into its domain. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The snowstorm of January 1978 is something I'll never forget. It wasn't just a storm. It was the kind of weather that froze the world in place, a relentless blizzard that made you feel as though the cold itself was alive. I was 26 at the time, working as a substitute teacher in a rural Ohio town, barely scraping by. My apartment was a drafty second-floor unit above a laundromat, but I considered myself lucky to have it, especially during a storm like that. That Friday, school had been canceled and everyone was advised to stay home. The snow had been falling steadily since the early morning, and by nightfall, the power had gone out. I lit a few candles and bundled up in blankets, trying to read by the dim, flickering light. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and every so often I thought I heard something else, a distant knocking sound. I chalked it up to the wind and tried to ignore it. Around 9 p.m., I heard a sharp, deliberate knock at my door. I froze. No one ever knocked on my door, especially not in the middle of a blizzard. My first thought was that it might be someone stranded in the storm, but something about the knock felt wrong. It wasn't frantic, as you'd expect from someone seeking help. It was slow, deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? I called, my voice shaky. No answer. The knock came again. Knock, knock, knock. Grabbing a flashlight, I approached the door cautiously. The hallway outside my apartment was pitch black. The power outage had plunged the entire building into darkness. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob, before finally opening it. There was no one there. The hallway was empty. The only sound, the faint creak of the old building settling in the cold. I shone my flashlight around, but there was nothing. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. I shut the door quickly, bolting it this time, and returned to my spot on the couch. But I couldn't relax. The air in the apartment felt heavier somehow, charged with something I couldn't explain. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting another knock, but it never came. Instead, the temperature in the room began to drop. I didn't think it was possible for it to get any colder, but it did. My breath puffed out invisible clouds, and even under the blankets, I started to shiver uncontrollably. The wind outside seemed to grow louder, almost deafening, and with it came a strange sound, a low, mournful wail, like someone crying in the distance. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The sound grew louder, closer, until it seemed to echo inside the apartment itself. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. And then I saw her. She was standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light of the candles. A woman, her figure translucent and shimmering like frost on a window pane. She was dressed in an old-fashioned coat, the kind with fur trim, and her hair hung in damp, tangled strands around her pale face. Her eyes, sunken, hollow, locked onto mine. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a rasping breath that barely carried over the howl of the wind. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. My body was frozen, as if the air itself had turned solid around me. She took a step closer, and I could see the ice crystals clinging to her hair, the frost spreading across the floor with every step she took. "Help me," she said again, her voice more urgent now. Somehow I managed to speak. What do you want?" Her hand lifted, pointing toward the window. "Out there," she whispered. "Find me." And then she was gone. The temperature in the room began to rise, the oppressive chill lifting as if it had never been there. But the frost on the floor remained, a glistening trail that led to the window. Against every instinct I had, I approached the window and looked out. The storm was still raging, the snow falling in thick sheets that obscured everything beyond a few feet. But in the faint glow of the street lamp outside, I saw something. A figure standing in the snow. It was her. She was standing motionless, staring up at me. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear her over the wind. Then, slowly, she raised one hand and pointed toward the edge of the woods behind the building. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was still in shock, or maybe some part of me felt compelled to obey. I grabbed my coat, scarf, and boots and ventured outside. The cold hit me like a slap, but I pressed on, following the direction she had pointed. The snow was deep, almost to my knees, and the wind made it nearly impossible to see. I stumbled forward, my flashlight barely cutting through the whiteout. Every so often I thought I saw her ahead of me, just out of reach, her figure disappearing into the swirling snow. Eventually, I reached the edge of the woods. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. I hesitated, but then I saw it, a faint glow in the distance, deep within the woods. I trudged toward it, the cold biting through my layers. The glow grew brighter as I approached, and soon I saw what it was, an old rusted car, half buried in the snow. The headlights were still on, though they flickered weakly, casting eerie shadows across the trees. Inside the car was her, She was slumped over the steering wheel, her coat dusted with frost, her face pale and lifeless. I couldn't understand how it was possible, how she could be there and yet have appeared in my apartment, but there was no mistaking it. It was her. I ran back to the building as fast as I could and called the police. It took them hours to reach the scene, but when they did, they confirmed what I already knew. The woman had died of hypothermia. Her car had skidded off the road and into the woods during the storm, and she'd been trapped there, unable to call for help. The officers said it must have been a coincidence that I found her. They said maybe I'd seen the glow of the headlights through the trees and followed it without realizing. But I knew the truth. She had come to me. She had asked for help. And somehow, I had heard her. I still think about her every winter when the snow falls heavy and the wind howls through the trees. I wonder if she's finally at peace or if she's still out there, waiting for someone else to hear her cry. Story the end.